can you tell me a bit about your and the David Lynch Foundation's, I don't know, is it a belief or is it more than a belief that if enough people, a significant number of people began to meditate, it would change the world? And like about some studies that have shown the impact of meditation, for example, on crime, the kind of, I suppose, practical consequences or results of meditation, I guess.
Well, it's all based on that hypothesis that we are at our foundation, that we're connected together. That's the hypothesis. That human consciousness, the mind at its deepest level, the deepest level of my nature, the deepest level of everyone's nature, that there's a unified field of consciousness that connects us together. If that's the case, then that field of consciousness, which would be just as substantive as the field of gravity, although transcendent to that, then that field would function according to the same laws that other fields do, field effects of consciousness. For example, you can have in a room, a large auditorium, two loudspeakers, and you can play one loudspeaker over on this corner of the room, and you can play another loudspeaker in the other corner of the room, and they're as loud as two loudspeakers. But you put them right next to each other, field effects, they're as loud as four loudspeakers. So the amplitude squares. 3 means 9, 10 means 100. So if you could translate that and say, okay, when we meditate, we're enlivening that underlying field, we're stirring that underlying field, connecting to that underlying field, and other people would do the same thing, then there would be a field effect. And then that positivity, that creativity, that peacefulness that exists down there would begin to manifest itself in our stressed, violent world. It's a big jump in logic to think that we're not just islands, but that we're connected together, and that you could access that in meditation. But now, to finish the point, there has been maybe 30 studies, largely ignored, unfortunately, but 30 studies published in peer-reviewed journals that showed when a small percentage of a population meditated together, that there were significant decreases in the sociological indicators of collective stress, crime, sickness rates, war deaths, that somehow the group meditation had just a calming effect. It's not because the meditators are getting onto a bus and smiling at the bus driver and, oh, isn't happiness contagious? It's because there's a level that we interface that we can actually reduce the stresses in the world. And to someone who says, well, that's just garbage, I would quote a Washington Post reporter who I spoke with, who heard this whole thing, and he said, I don't believe a word of it, but I've been a Washington Post reporter, bureau chief in Moscow for 10 years. And he said, I just pray that it could work, because it's not limited by borders. It's not limited by economics or religion. It's just on that level of common field effects. And the David Lynch Foundation, along with the TM organization, is working to establish groups of advanced meditators who could produce this effect. Without, you don't have to believe in it, they just want to do it. You could never get the world to believe it anyway, but you can still produce the effect.
Wow. So it could be like a Philip K. Dick sci-fi world where there are pods of meditators around the world to ensure that each community has a sustainable level of serenity that they're connected to.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds funny, but the fact of the matter is, it would be nice you could even say like a lighthouse, like you've got, it's going back to that Kali Yuga thing. It's night, it's dark, and people are smashing into each other, and there's all these problems. And this is, again, an ancient principle, the second element. You have darkness, and where did the darkness come from? Who's to blame? Let's set up committees, let's have boards. Where did it come from? And then someone comes along and says, well, here's a switch. Let's just turn on the light, and the darkness disappears. Turns out darkness is just the absence of light. It has no reality on its own in this model. So yes, in a very dark time when people are don't know, they're not using the full creative potential of their brain. They're sort of kicking around and smashing into each other, that if you had in society some like lighthouses, it could help. It could help.
In a world where people are sort of bludgeoned by materialism and, well, let's say empiricism, the idea that people meditating, or a percentage of the population frequently meditating in union, could have a meaningful, tangible effect on, like you said, stress markers, seems absurd until you consider the limitations, the limits of the senses. Someone explained to me that we only see 0.2% of the available light range, that they're now developing ways of seeing electromagnetic lights, and what about neutrinos? Someone explained to me like that they're also inconceivably small. When you were talking about that ocean earlier, Bob, and the 50-foot waves, and at the level of the absolute, in the profound level of the ocean, it would remain undisturbed. I also thought on the submolecular level, regardless of whether or not they were 50-foot waves or completely still, the water would still be the same on a molecular level. And I suppose what the leap of faith that we are invited to undertake if we are to live a spiritual life, which isn't a word I hear you use that often thinking about it, is what is the unseen world? Can the unseen world influence the markers that we have become so devoted to? The world of categories and taxonomies, the world of hierarchies and visible dominance. Can we get beyond it, particularly as we begin to understand through science the limitations of what can be seen and what can be measured?
Well, first of all, human perception, we see our life, as you just said, through this very narrow prism of waking state of consciousness. I'm asleep and I'm dreaming, and now I'm awake, and this is reality, and this is my world. And then, of course, we know that my world is influenced if I didn't sleep well, or if I ate terrible food, or if somebody was bitchy to me or something, and then it activates my amygdala. So what I know to be real is when I'm stressed is very narrow, and I don't trust you. But then people, and we're around enough people, that there's rare souls that are sort of comfortable in themselves, fine in themselves. They're not object referral. I know myself in terms of everybody else's appreciation. That's been a journey you've been on. We've talked about that over the years. And I'm more self-referral. I know myself. Then those perceptions of differences and dualities and fighting and the whole history began to dissipate. So I'm not exactly answering your question yet, but I do want to make the point that there's a range of human nature that if you had more people doing things like transcendental meditation and other work, it's not just a standalone, and other work, you're going to see a change in society. You're going to see it as society becomes less stressed, less trauma. You're going to definitely see that. Do these deeper realms of the world of creation influence how we behave? I think, if you're looking at, you're driving in certain areas of a city and there's been a lot of violence in that city, you can feel the tension, and you drive in other areas of the country and you feel relaxed. So I think collective consciousness does have a huge effect on the way we behave.
Yeah, and like somewhat anecdotally, but I think there is data on like that when there's a high profile boxing match or UFC tournament, the incidences of violence and A&E cases goes up. And like that, someone told me that when there's an event of global significance, there is they can register spikes in a random this guy Paul McKenna, a wonderful fella, in fact, explained to me once that there's these machines that are sort of like random code generators. They said it's like, if you can, to simplify it, imagine a machine continually flipping a coin, heads, tails, tails, heads, tails, 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 heads, heads, tails, tails. He said that when there's an event of mass consciousness, these machines respond like that. When there's a 9/11 or a death of Diana, and likely a coronavirus, there's a sort of some sort of invisible wave travels through us. And on a more profane and literary, if not literal level, the existence of mythology, the existence of archetypes, the existence of stories that resonate, even the existence of any kind of popular culture suggests that on some level we are able to read similar experiences from external information. And even more so, even though at least academically people are reluctant to assume that there is such a thing as the universal. It's, we accept that we're all basically made of carbon. We accept that we've all basically got heart, lung, kidneys, 10 fingers, 10 toes. I mean, on a readable, tangible, material level, there seems to be universal imprints with myriad variations within them. And the idea that there are strata that increase, the deeper you go, become more and more unified, for me seems plausible. And also, but given that it's correlative to the idea that we should live peacefully, harmoniously, and at one with one another, respecting our individuality and difference, doesn't seem like a toxic idea. When I've spoken to people that are opposed to these ideas, they say, yeah, but what happens is one person's universal gets imposed as the right, and is a Christian white male version of what's right. And I think, no, we can't just dissect our way out of utopia by focusing on that.